All right, so the original talk of my presentation was the praxeology of theory, and the subtitle was Process versus Equilibrium, where I was going to focus on the difference between process and stasis. Unfortunately, the kind of boring subtitle eventually became the main title in the main program. However, I had to drop out a lot of the stasis versus equilibrium elements, and now I'm going to present it more as a Mengerian Pragmatism. Whereas Professor Cordova focused on the philosophical foundations of praxeology, I'm not trying to disagree with that at all, but what I am trying to do is provide a praxeological foundation for philosophy. Praxeology is the science of action. Semiotics is the science of signs. And the overlap between these two fields lies Menger's price theory, prices being the signs or symbols by which economic actors seek to influence the purchasing decisions of their potential consumers. Pragmatism, as I will use the term, can be understood as a generalization of Menger's price theory to a theory of all sign and symbol production and communication in general. The potential benefits of a Mengerian pragmatism would include, the main one is a praxeological analysis of democratic processes. My talk was largely inspired by Jürgen Habermas's theory of communicative action, where he tries to complain that modern society is steered by prices rather than by public deliberation. Well, what my approach does is that a praxeological understanding of language shows that the difference between prices and language isn't as interesting as he likes to think it is. So it's meant as a challenge to his theory. We could also better understand advertising, negotiations, property rights, contracts. These are all symbols that humans use within the economic process. We can analyze the production, distribution, and consumption of economic theory. Economists are themselves part of the economy, and they compete within a market. And finally, we can better understand the nature of human rationality, which is what praxeology is all about. Not only will my approach follow that of Menger in terms of generalizing his price theory, but I'm also going to follow his methodology as well by using a compositional approach, where I'm going to start with human actions in general, then narrow it down to a smaller field of the human actions that are aimed at producing signs and symbols, and then finally I'm going to finish with a praxeological analysis of theory, which is a specific subset of symbols. By signs, many forms of semiotics treat almost anything as a sign. That's not what I'm going to do. By signs, I mean something that is actively produced with the intention of influencing some audience. The main points that I'm going to cover would include that all science is the human production of symbols for the sake of two things. One, steering an audience towards or away from desired end result, and avoiding censure from third-person public review. I will contrast this with Spectator theories of disinterested contemplation, which replace these two ends with a disinterested correspondence between sign and object, and a disinterested logical entailment from sign to another sign. So let's start off with human actions in general. While Mises's comments on communicative action somewhat stray from the praxeological method, I think, his powerful analysis of non-communicative action must be our starting point. Every human action by his reading, and I fully agree with it, has the following characteristics. All human action is interest-laden in that it's aimed at some subjective end. It's interventionist and it's aimed at influencing the causal world. It's experience-based in that it's aimed at some future experience which is thought to relieve felt uneasiness. And it's fallible in that it's speculative and uncertain whether the action will be successful or not. Menger's approach to price theory was to analyze the price-setting process in terms of the producer's desired end results, where he wants to influence his consumers in a certain way, and he sets his price accordingly. Pragmatism is the view that we can analyze all communicative actions in this same way. So consider the following passage here. Austrian economists consider prices to be an instrument or tool for prediction, problem solving, and action, and rejects the idea that the function of prices is to describe, represent, or mirror independently existing values. I'm not sure if all Austrians would necessarily agree with that, but I think that's a pretty fair representation of the way that Austrian economics departs from central planners. Well, this is exactly what pragmatism is, only a bigger scale. Pragmatists consider signs to be an instrument or tool for prediction, problem solving, and action, and reject the idea that the function of signs or language in general is to describe, represent, or mirror independently existing objects. The inventor of pragmatism was Charles Saunders Peirce. He was an American logician, which wrote around 1870 is when he invented pragmatism. Peirce insisted that implication, inference, assertion, contradiction, and validation are all human actions rather than disembodied and disinterested relations that just hold. He thus insisted that all logical terms must be cashed out in terms of human action rather than reified in an ideal realm of abstract relations. The big problem with Peirce, however, is that he simply wasn't praxeological enough. One way of understanding Peirce's contribution is to see how he is his enormous threat against logical positivism. Peirce had a very strong influence upon two thinkers. One was Frank Ramsey, and the other was C.I. Lewis. These, in turn, had two very influential students, whose Peircean influence trickled down into the later Wittgenstein and Willard van Orman Quine. So if you see a lot of similarities between their ideas and what I'm about to present, they come from Peirce. In my opinion, Peirce is the greatest philosopher of all time, and he presents the greatest threat to logical positivism, and he's indirectly responsible for its overthrow. According to Peirce, there are three levels of understanding a sign. One way of first I want to contrast it with the verificationist principle that lies at the heart of logical positivism. They say that a sentence has certain conditions for verification, and if there are no conditions for verification, then the sentence is meaningless. What a Mengerian pragmatism would say is that I would turn it on its head, saying it's precisely because the producer of the sign thinks that will have some effect on the world that he creates the sign in the first place. So all signs, at least the speaker thinks, will have meaning of some type or another. The first type of sign is, the first level of understanding a sign is the unreflective competence in use. This isn't very interesting, and I'll just move on from there. The second level of understanding what any sign or symbol means is identifying the necessary and sufficient conditions of valid use. Very close to the verificationist principle, but not quite. Finally, the third level is identifying the ends that are furthered and foregone by using the sign in human action. Communication, as I will describe it, is an intrinsically social process. All signs require a first person to write or speak the sign, a second person whose future actions the first person intends to influence, and one subset of signs, a very special subset, symbols, also requires a third person mediating public that is familiar with and potentially supports or opposes the actions above. Thus, the meaning of a sign, the meaning of all signs has a ground level, which is the desired end result. It is not that second level that I just described earlier. Rather, it's the third level. All signs have a desired end result, and we can understand this meaning by asking the question, what future actions does the first person seek to steer the second person towards or away from? The subset of signs as symbols, they add a higher level to it as well. They don't replace it, they add to it with valid inferences. We can understand these by asking the question, what can the third person public hold the first person responsible for implying and the second person responsible for inferring when they produce a sign? Pragmatism claims that both levels are necessary to any analysis of theory. All signs gain meaning from the ground level of useful inductions, while linguistic and mathematical symbols, for example, deepen their meaning to the higher level of valid deductions. Thus, all signs are necessarily aimed at influencing and coordinating some audience. They are only contingently aimed at representing, describing, expressing, referencing, or mirroring the inner or outer world. It might do these things, but that isn't the necessary purpose of a sign. So I built this little diagram here to illustrate the sign production process. The first person, he desires some end results. And he also perceives that there's a second person around him. And if he can get this second person to also want those exact same end results by producing a sign, well, that's how he's going to accomplish that end result. Thus, his desire for the end results and his understanding of the second person audience determines which sign he will produce. Thus, he hopes, causing the second person to respond in the way that he hopes. Whether the first person perceives some objective world, he might do it, he might not. That is not a necessary part of the process, which is why it's kind of transparent there. argue that there are three types of signs. The first would be icons, which is a resemblance. An example of this would be a picture of a tree, looks like a tree. That's how it gains its meaning. This only requires one person, and these are parts of the signs that I don't want to talk about. The second type would be an index. An index is an empirically induced inference from signs to end results. This requires two-person minimum under the analysis that I'm presenting. An example of this would be tribes of fervet monkeys, where a certain tribe will have three different calls, one which is about snakes, one which is about hawks, and one which is about leopards. And each one of those signs refers to the response that you're supposed to take in the presence of a snake, leopard, or hawk. The signs in no way resemble the actual snake or hawk. There's just an empirically induced correlation between the two. The third type of sign is a symbol. And symbols gain meaning not by way of resemblance and not by way of an inductive association, but by way of conventional deductions from one sign to another. This process requires three people at least. There are certain preconditions for an index. The meaning of index cannot be arbitrary with respect to an objective context of the sign production, since that's where the empirical inductions come from, and the subjective desires of the first and second person, since without desires, then neither of the people will make the necessary inferences and inductions. The meaning of symbols, however, is arbitrary with respect to both the objective context and the subjective desires of the first and second person, which is exactly why a third-person mediation is a precondition for symbol use. The argument for the third person for requiring three people for symbols basically goes as follows. Like prices, signs are a means to some desired end rather than a desired end in and of itself. Since signs are not desired ends, they cannot be inferred from another sign, which is the defining feature of symbols. Thus, symbols are thus arbitrary with respect to causal associations and subjective ends, which is why the third-person rewards and censures provide the necessary ends that are needed in order to reinforce the inference relations. First-person assertion, second-person contradiction, and third-person mediation is the social process by which all symbol-using community necessarily standardize the non-subjective validity of sign-to-sign inference and give symbols their non-subjective meaning. A priori knowledge consists in our learning this non-subjective system of symbolic inferences, which is structured by this three-party process. Thus, getting back to our original diagram here, I'll kind of split it out into 5 different objects with 5 different signs and 5 different end results, basically a fancier version of the case of the fervet monkeys. What symbols do is they bring inferences in between the signs. And again, these arrows are actions. They're not abstract relations. They're not disembodied in any sense. Third-person mediation provides the necessary ends to establish the sign-to-sign inferences by incentivizing all the valid inferences that I otherwise would not want to infer, and incentivizing all the invalid inferences that I might otherwise want to infer, disincentivizing all the invalid inferences I might otherwise want to infer. One of the main purposes of symbols is that it allows us to present some states from ever existing. I don't know if you saw it, but some of the objects disappeared. We can have signs for objects that have never existed. Indeed, part of the purpose of symbols is to prevent some states of the world from ever existing, or to purposely bring some states into existence for the first time ever. Thus, we can understand the difference between these signs in terms of 3 stages to deductive reasoning. The first stage would have 2 people just doing signs back and forth one to another. This is not deduction. Each person merely induces what the other person might mean by any sign. The second level would be the third-person scenario that I've just been discussing. Third-person mediation solidifies the non-subjective meanings of signs. Signs have meaning independent of any first or second person's interests, and this is the process of public deliberation by which our signs come to have meaning. Third, we have first-person deliberation, where a first person uses these non-subjective meanings, which they learned in the process above, to conceptualize and rationally plan their action within the world. This is the process of private deliberation. Thus, symbols can be organized by way of their deductive meanings into sentences, functions, or thoughts, and these can be organized into arguments, theories, and plans of action. How different symbol-using communities actually accomplish this is a question for historians, psychologists, and linguists linguistics, and is entirely separate from both pragmatism and praxeology. So to summarize, the ends of all communicative action and theory include an inductive utility of furthering and foregoing your own ends, which corresponds to influencing the second person's future actions, and the deductive validity of a formal definition, which corresponds to avoiding the censure of a third-person public review. Now I wanted to give a brief overview of how Mises himself, how close he comes to and where he departs from this pragmatic model that I'm presenting. While Mises' comments on communicative action often stray from the praxeological method, at other times he gets things exactly right. For whatever reason, Mises understands the production of written and spoken signs differently than he does the production of prices by a seller. He frequently and somewhat consistently speaks as if the essential function of language and communication is description or representation, while the realization of a certain purpose is merely contingent. But this is to get things exactly backwards. He thus describes communication and the sign production process as he wishes it were, rather than it actually is. Here's an example. To express wishes and hopes, Mises says, and to announce planned action may be a form of action, insofar as they aim in themselves at the realization of a certain purpose. That's not quite right. A better way would be to say that they absolutely are forms of action that are, like all other actions, aimed at the realization of a certain purpose. There are lots of passages where he says basically the same thing. Here's another example. No man is qualified to describe what would make another man happier or less discontented. In this passage, Mises is playing the role of the third-person invalidator of the critic's sign production, saying that he's not allowed to produce those signs. He's not qualified to do it. And he's playing the role of the third-person mediation. He continues, the critic either describes what he believes he would aim at if he were in the place of his fellow, or in dictatorial arrogance describes what condition this other man would better suit himself, the critic. I'm not necessarily saying that the critic isn't doing these things. He might be, but he's not necessarily doing that, and we don't get to assume that the description of inner states is what the critic really is seeking to do. In other places, however, Mises gives a praxeological analysis of science exactly right. This is one of my favorite passages. He says, the evidence that we have correctly perceived a causal relation is provided only by the fact that action guided by this knowledge results in the expected outcome. Pragmatists shout for joy when they see that. Evidence by this is the product of success or failure in human action, which means it cannot be fully disinterested because human action never is. He continues, the archetype of causality research, and I love that term, causality research. I think by that he means natural science, and I hope he includes economics. Where and how must I intervene in order to divert the course of events from the way it would go in the absence of my interference in a direction which better suits my wishes? That's as pragmatic as it gets. Only later was this search more extensively interpreted by metaphysics as a search after the ultimate cause of being in existence. This is the spectator theory of inquiry which all pragmatists rail against. According to this perspective of inquiry, inquiry in science came to be portrayed as the disinterested contemplation of correspondence and logical entailment rather than the end-oriented intervention in the shared world of scarcity. Such an idealized view of sign production is a clear departure from the praxeological method. Mises continues, centuries were needed to bring these exaggerated and extravagant ideas back again to the more modest question of where one must interfere in order to attain this or that end. And this is the heart and soul of pragmatism. So finally, we can do a brief praxeological analysis of different types of theory. And I'm going to present an analysis of 4 different types. I've already presented an analysis of pragmatism, but I'm also going to analyze empiricism, rationalism, and postmodernism. With good reason, Austrian economists tend to rail against empiricism because that's the main competitor that they've had to compete against. But that doesn't mean that rationalism is the only other option. The theories that I'm going to deal with are pretty diverse and far more developed than I give them credit for. I can, however, mark the points at which pragmatism parts ways with empiricism, rationalism, and postmodernism. To review, theorists are primarily the producers of symbolic goods. That is their job within the economy. Because all economic theories are symbols produced by human actions, they are necessarily interest-laden, never value-free, interventionist, never done for its own sake. In the case of Austrian economics, it's intervening in the intervention process, but that's not the same as disinterested contemplation. It's experience-based, but not necessarily in past experience. And it's fallible. Future objections or improvements to any theory are always possible. And finally, they are always social in that they're typically grounded in a third-person review and criticism. Scientific inquiry, by these lights, and economics is included, is the creative production and refinement of better sign-to-sign inferences. Those are the goods that they provide their potential market. So going back to our original diagram of pragmatism here, the central feature is that the first and second persons within this diagram both seek the same end result in blue, and they both seek to avoid public censure. That's what makes the meaning of signs non-private. All arrows in this diagram represent desires or actions. There are no disinterested relations anywhere. To repeat again, we've got the ground level at which all signs have some meaning regarding the desired results, and then the higher level has valid inferences. To take a very simplified example, how do we know that the symbols 5, 5, and 5 all mean the same thing? The ground level says that when I ask for 5, 5, or 5 apples, I'm expecting to walk away with the same number of apples in my hand. That's the future state. The higher level of meaning to these symbols only deepens this meaning rather than replacing it, by showing how 5, 5, and 5 are all defined by an isomorphic set of valid and invalid inferences to other signs. Without the interest-laden ground level, however, this higher level is totally irrelevant to human action. The most important point here is that inference and interpretation are always interest-laden actions rather than disinterested relations that just are. Now, if we ignore the higher level altogether and see the ground level in terms of relations of sign-to-object correspondence rather than interest-laden actions, we get empiricism. Here's pragmatism, and then here's basically what a model of empiricism would look like, where all of the actions have basically been eliminated, especially the end results. And then there's just kind of a line that connects objects to signs while they're kind of a little bit nervous about the actions that might actually do it. They're disinterested relations that just are. Now back to the pragmatist theory of meaning. What the rationalist does, it looks very similar. What the rationalist does is include both levels, but sees both levels not in terms of interest-laden actions, but in terms of the disinterested relations of entailment between signs and correspondence between signs and objects. This, I suggest, is equivalent to the idea that there is a self-existing equilibrium level towards which all prices converge independent of all human actions. So whereas here's empiricism, rationalism adds logical relations. It doesn't deny empirical content, but it adds rational relations as well, or logical relations as well. What the postmodernist does is ignore the ground level altogether and see the higher level in terms of a free play of signs that are somehow able to generate and imply themselves, independent of all interest-laden human actions. But there is no free play of signs for the same reason that there is no free lunch. Both things are necessarily the products of human action within a shared world of scarcity. So here's rationalism. Postmodernism denies the objective content, or the empirical content, and then says that it's just signs all the way around. It's not a static model like the other ones are, but it absolutely opposes a praxeological foundation to this process. And here's back to the original model that I am advocating, where the blue and the yellow arrows are the ends which each party seeks, and that's what defines the shared meaning. So in conclusion, all theory is the production of symbols by human action aimed at two end results. There might be other end results as well, but these two are necessarily a part of it. Steering a second-person audience towards or away from some desired end result, and avoiding censure from the mediating third-person public. The spectator theories of disinterested contemplation replace these actions with disinterested and static correspondence between signs and objects, and disinterested and static logical entailments between signs. Praxeology insists that it is impossible for anybody to act or speak as someone that has no subjective ends whatsoever. it's a contradiction in terms. But this is exactly what the Spectator theories of contemplation claim for themselves. What pragmatism does is identify the ends which all theory must necessarily be aimed at, whatever else it may or may not seek to accomplish. The scientific ideal for pragmatism is the production of new and improved sign-to-sign inferences, according to which we might all have greater success in achieving and coordinating our subjective ends within our shared world of scarcity. I think this is exactly what Mises meant when he referred to science as causality research. If somebody wants more than that for science, then pragmatism cannot provide it. But then praxeologists deny that anybody ever could satisfy the desire to rise above and transcend all desires. It's not clear why scientists should be the unique exception to this rule. Thank you very much.
We will have a very brief comment by Jörg. Please do not extend to the limit of 10 minutes.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for this talk. And just like you, I think that the connection between semiotics, action theory, praxeology, and economic theory is not perceived as important as it indeed is, especially the connection via the theory of human action. I have structured my comments into 3 parts. In the first part, I will say, thank you very much, I will say some things about the talk in general and where I maybe disagree. In the second part, I will give philosophical outlook on your philosophical talk. But first, let me know, who of you is familiar with the concept of the direction of fit? 3 persons, and I know it's some more. So small part of our audience. Well, we will look why the direction of fit gives us an answer why science cannot be perceived as disinterested connections between science and objects, symbols and objects. In the next part, I will suggest that we can arrive at a plausible concept of symbols without referring to a third person, just as a free play of 2 agents. And then I am done, and I hope it will be shorter than 10 minutes. Well, firstly, the question about the relation between symbols and prices boils down to human action, as you correctly pointed out, and I think we can do an analysis of prices as well as of symbols when we look at 2 persons, 2 actors, which try to cooperate. So the third person, which you introduced as someone who is correcting the use of signs, if I understood you correctly. Incentivizing. Thing is not necessary. Well, let's have a look at the direction of fit and why symbols can not be perceived free of interests. The concept of direction of fit was introduced by Elizabeth Anscombe, and she gives us a small thought experiment. We can see a detective and a husband, and the husband is shopping and he has a shopping list, and on his shopping list there is an item, butter. But instead of butter he buys margarine. So we have a mistake, but where's the mistake? The mistake is not in the world where the margarine is, but it is on the list. The mistake is in the world where the margarine is, but not on the list. It should be butter. But the detective who follows our husband, if he has a list and there is margarine and he has a record of what is the case in the world, then the mistake, if he has another item on the list, is on the list instead of in the world. So let me make this clear. I think it's not yet. There are two possibilities to have a mistake. First, on the list, because the intention was not carried out correctly. Secondly, in the world, because the list does not represent the world as it is. So when we are looking at science, we have a connection between the world and the science, but this connection is not free from interest. There are agents who want to do something with science. And assuming that we can subtract the interest of agents from the purpose of science is not seeing that the agents intend to do something with science which can be describing the world. You said it's a contingent aspect of science that they describe the world. I'm not sure if I fully agree with that, but at least it's a necessary aspect of science that they incorporate something that agents want. The next comment I would like to make is again on the assumption that we would need a third person. I would suggest that we can reconstruct the genesis of science and symbols by looking at only two persons who are in some kind of prisoner's dilemma situation, where one person is in a desperate need to communicate with the other person. And, well, we could say, why should I use your sign? Let's use my sign. And if we insist on this point, we will never agree on one sign or one symbol, whatever. But assuming we have a shared set of ends, we hope that we realize more of our ends in the future if we agree on some signs and symbols. Then we can find out by iteration of the dilemma situation which signs work and which signs don't. So we had several acts. The first would be I present you my sign, you present me your sign, and we both have different signs, we don't understand each other. In the next step, I adapt your sign and I try to find what you wanted to show me. And so we can converge on a shared set of symbols without the need of a third person who intervenes. But we must have some history of the creation of these symbols. So it's more than two acts, it's more than one act. Maybe that's what the third person was intended to be the third act, I would say the agreeing, after we have gathered the information. Lastly, the connection between prices and symbols. I find it striking that we see that those who fail to use prices accordingly to a subjective set of attitudes within the marketplace fail to sell their goods. And in the same way, people who do not use their symbols accordingly to a subjective set of shared attitudes within, this case, not marketplace, but society, fail to communicate. That's it. Thank you.
To explain how we are going to proceed. There is now a brief time for discussion after every talk now, apart from the first one, 10 minutes. And then you can help yourself to coffee, which is situated over there in the corner. Well, it's not a corner, but there's coffee. And we will start sharp at 12 o'clock with the next talk. So there is the floor is open for discussion now.
Really? I assumed I disagreed with almost everyone here.
Well, let's first focus on when we agree. I think there are a few passages in the talk that I like very much, especially when you go on about that certain things qualify as action, and reasons sometimes
So basically you're asking what's the point? Okay. The point that I see is in that early slide when I discussed how it could inform an analysis of negotiations and science, the scientific market, if we could call it that, and actions, the economic market within which economic theories themselves compete. It seems like they should be interested in that. And I think it also informs the nature of human rationality. I think one of the biggest corrections that I think that it offers to praxeology is sometimes they get a little carried away where were the... Like these 5 aspects of praxeological theory should have made most praxeologists get a little nervous, thinking that there's no such thing as value-free theory, there's no such thing as theory for its own sake. I think all of these things are at least, they fill out some parts that praxeological theory was missing under a rationalist interpretation. And it also reins in a little bit of dogmatism where, yes, a priori theory is fantastic. That's how we come up with new ideas and better actions. But it doesn't mean that it's dogmatically true that sometimes, which is the language that I think Mises sometimes gets into. I don't know if that answered your question, or was there...
Not fully.
Okay.
So I can see that when you say even the actions of an economist are somewhat interest-laden, that's really but the point of this pragmatist approach, so how is it complementary to economic theory? Yeah, I mean, I understand that it is complementary to maybe praxeology or something, but to economic theory, is there a link?
Well, Mises describes catalactics as if it's totally indifferent whether they know how to speak any language at all. And that to me is pretty misleading. He describes all human action as or catalactics as a 2-party action. Whereas if we describe human action as necessarily a 3-party scenario, that's a pretty radical departure and corrective to what Mises has himself suggested. Where neutrality of the third party, it's not indifference that's such that we can reduce it to a 2-party relationship. Rather, the third party mediating public protects the interaction between the 2 parties. And that's not neutral. That's an action in and of itself that they protect those actions. And Mises doesn't really seem to have the tools for that. He just assumes that it's just a whole bunch of 2-party interactions rather than a 3-party interaction.
Human action can be 1 part.
Well, I mean, sorry, catalactics. Catalactics, I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you. I have 2 questions. One concerns the interaction with the party. The second one concerns your mentioning rationality. Well, my first question, you just mentioned that there is, in your opinion, an interaction between 3 parties, 2 parties, typically interacting because they might have exchange things, right? And the third party also being
Okay, with regards to the first question, which I think pinpoints exactly where I had to skip over some of the most important stuff, providing a praxeological analysis of third-party mediation, that's a really big topic which deserves a half-hour presentation in and of itself. And basically, I had to black box what exactly is going on there. I just had to show that it needs to be there. If signs are going to have non-subjective meaning from which we can make deductions rather than just inducing reliably upon the same meaning of a sign, we need a third party to replace the roles that used to be played by the objective world and the subjective interactions or the subjective associations between a sign and the end result. That's why the third party is necessary, but you're absolutely right. I have black boxed the third party, so I don't really want to say too much about it because my thoughts aren't totally clear on the subject yet. I have a lot more to say, but that doesn't mean that it would be worth your while to listen to it. The second question that you had was about my comments on rationalism, which, briefly, rationalism, I think, is the one that is by far most compatible with pragmatism, in that they're pretty neutral as to whether these relations are human actions or not. They just kind of sideline the question and move on, very similar to how neoclassical economics deals with economics. Neoclassical economists deal with economics. And that's what I think rationalists do as well. They're not necessarily denying that any of these are human actions, but they're not explicitly stating it and going from that fundamental departure point either. On the other hand, I do think that this pragmatic analysis is a definitive refutation of empiricism or postmodernism. And I think that's a good contribution. I don't know, sorry.
There's just space for one more question by you and Paul, and I ask you to answer very briefly. Sorry, time for discussion is so short, not all questions can be answered before, but there will be a closing discussion at 6 p.m., so write your questions down and then address them.
Okay, could you please go back to slide 5, characteristics of
Yes.
which was just a second ago. I have a very simple question. First of all, I think point 2 is very important for your whole approach, that human action is interventionist. And as
Economic theory is interventionist. Sorry, this slide is about economic theory is necessarily interventionist.
economic theory is necessarily interventionist, and you, as far as I understood you deduced that from the fact that all human actions
Yes.
are interventionist.
Yes.
So it's a praxeological deduction
Yes.
from this fact. Okay. Where did you get this from, that human action is interventionist? Because maybe we'll hear it later on in Mr. Hageman's talk. There are praxeologists who are of the opinion that there are actions which are done for its own sake. So that means and ends are the same thing. Like playing the piano, that's an example that's sometimes given.
You're talking about willful passivity. Like I plan, things are going to go great how I like it, so all I need to do is sit back and I intentionally do that. And that's the sense of non-interventionism that you mean, or?
No, the example that's given is playing the piano.
Mm-hmm.
Myself playing the piano alone at home, just
Right.
for enjoying myself playing the piano. That's an example that's sometimes given. So my question is, where did you get this from, that human action is always interventionist?
It intervenes in the causal world, which also may include other people. I mean, some people could be writing it for their own sake, but if you're writing a book for the sake of publishing it, or you're giving a lecture to an audience, then you're not doing it for its own sake. You're doing it to influence an audience, and in that sense, it's interventionist.
But also it's something that you yourself read.
No, Mises himself said that all action is interventionist, and since theory is action, that's where I'm coming from. Right.
And when you play the piano, I piano. So you play piano, you intervene in your feeling, your soul. You play something that makes you feel good. Okay, so you intervene in your sensual soul state, no?
Nothing more than the quote that I had of Mises saying you steer the causal world in a direction that's all I mean by it.
Yes, but that maybe we'll hear later on. That's
Okay.
interesting theory by Newton.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Maybe sometimes there's no difference between
Right.
means and action.
Well, let me intervene in this case. Sorry, I apologize for the fact that the program is so replete with supported presentations that we cannot so please be patient. There will be a closing discussion, and please bear with me when I ask you to respect the time limit. So now is the time for coffee and for seeing the rest of the instance. There's a